actually start in 1991 as the Soviet Union itself began its final hurdle toward collapse and disintegration. While this was taking place, the U.S., as the historical record makes very clear, was very much caught off guard. The George H.W. Bush administration spent months during that year trying to find some kind of new strategy as it pertains to what was then this splintering superpower in the Soviet Union. And the course that Washington ended up choosing was simple. It chose to prioritize relations with Moscow and prevent the disintegration of the Soviet Empire and eventually Russia from going too far. And that meant in many cases simply sitting on our hands. Instead of offering diplomatic or even material support to new countries, new nations, declaring independence, declaring sovereignty from Moscow's empire, the U.S. actively worked to prevent certain pro-sovereignty movements from succeeding. Think of Bush's infamous Chicken Kiev speech in 1991, where he publicly criticized Ukrainian separatists for trying to break away from Moscow, which unfortunately has not aged very well whatsoever. And there was a logic to all of this. After all, this was a country in the Soviet Union that was a country with a significant nuclear arsenal. And no one wanted that arsenal to fall into the wrong hands. And the West, and the US especially, perhaps understandably, thought at the time that so long as Russia transitioned into a market economy and held free and fair elections, that actual borders and boundaries wouldn't necessarily matter quite so much. And again, you can see the logic to this argument. This was all taking place amidst a far broader ignorance in the West, and again, especially in the United States of America, of the history of Russian imperialism and Russian colonization writ large, and of understanding that Russia continues to oversee what is in many ways a traditional European empire, only that instead of colonizing nations and peoples overseas, it instead colonized nations and peoples over land. That is to say, Russia didn't create a transoceanic empire of colonized nations, but a transcontinental empire of colonized nations. Now, in the 1990s, the trade-off was clear. Instead of backing these independence and pro-sovereignty movements rising up against imperialists in Moscow, the U.S. either dragged its feet or willingly turned a blind eye to these movements. And this wasn't just the case in places like Ukraine or Georgia or Moldova or Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan or Azerbaijan. That goes also for the colonized nations that are still considered part of Russia proper. Because in the early 1990s, so many of these nations also pushed for increased sovereignty, in some cases even outright independence. These are nations like Chechnya, which had clear majority support for independence in the early 1990s and yet received no support whatsoever from the West, even though the West could likely have stopped the violence and result in tens of thousands of deaths that came from the Chechen wars. It goes for nations like Tatarstan, which Representative Cohen just mentioned, which was first colonized by Russia centuries ago, but which in the early 1990s clearly voted for equal footing with Russia itself, and again received no help whatsoever from the West. Over and over and over again, these indigenous and colonized nations pushed for sovereignty in the 1990s, and again, the West placed all of its hopes on a market economy, on democratic norms, changing Russia, changing the Kremlin to such an extent, preventing a return to the kind of Russian imperialism we see now, that these anti-colonial movements wouldn't end up mattering. This was administration after administration in the US that pursued this policy. It happened year after year, decade after decade. And 30 years later, from the vantage point of here we are in 2022, it is as clear as day that that policy has failed. Bhakti, as you mentioned, Ukraine is the latest manifestation of this failure, but it will not be the last. And the reason is simple. Russia remains the only European empire that has never come close to fully decolonizing. It's the only European country that hasn't come anywhere close to fully reckoning with its colonial history. That reckoning is coming regardless of what the West does. It may come in 5 years, it may come in a decade, and maybe as soon as next year when Russia's economy begins to accelerate toward outright depression. Regardless of when it happens, the West, and especially the US, has to be ready, because the West was not ready in 1991 when it did all that it could to try to keep the Russian Federation patched together, and then turned a blind eye when the Kremlin began smothering these anti-colonial movements and recreating dictatorship in Moscow. And